Love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a soul.
Chapter 15 and verse 40. The centurion has just witnessed his death and professed faith. And then it tells us there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. And when he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. These two verses are interesting to me and are of some significance that I think are worth talking about. Beyond just the connection with the crucifixion, because he doesn't stay there. He actually expands. He introduces that they were there, and then he uses that introduction to expand and talk about them for these two verses in some what I consider significant ways, because it is a very, 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 very common modern critique of the Bible and of Christianity in particular, that it is anti-women. Largely because of teachings in the scriptures about wives being submissive to their husbands, or because of teachings in the scriptures about women not leading in the public assemblies. It is presumed that it is out of step with modern views on women's liberation and women's equality. That's nonsense. And it becomes clear that it's nonsense actually way back in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Because when man and woman are presented in Genesis 1, they are presented as what? An equal partnership that creates mankind. He made them male and female. That's the first statement. God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Let him do this, let him do that. And the last statement on the back end of that is, he made them male and female. All right. Chapter 2 then breaks down the process of making them male and female and the teaching that went on in that process, which is he formed Adam first. He had Adam name all the animals that had been created on the land, which he found were not fit partners for him. Having not found a mate, God then puts him to sleep, takes a part of him, and fashions it into a woman. He then presents the woman to the man, and the man's response is, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of men. Presented from the very outset as being a part of the same creation, the same bone, the same flesh, completely equal in nature. Both created in the image of God. Then it proceeds to assign roles and responsibilities. Roles and responsibilities have nothing to do with value. And that's where people make their big mistake. Just because you have a more important And that's an opinion, by the way. Anytime you rank order things, you're dealing with opinion. Anytime you have a more important role, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are better than anyone else, or more valuable than anyone else, or more needed than anyone else. It just simply says that you have a separate set of responsibilities that fall to you. That's all it does. That's all a role does. There are so many different places that could be illustrated. But for one, because someone is elected president of the United States, do they become a better person? Read your history books if you've got any questions about that. They're certainly not better people. Sometimes we do a pretty lousy job of picking them too. But you don't automatically get to conclude that you're more important than someone. Now, we treat them that way. No doubt about the fact that we treat them that way. We got people that we tell, hey, your job is, if someone tries to kill this guy, your job is to die instead of them. His protection detail, that's their ultimate responsibility. Make sure that he doesn't get killed. And if that means they have to throw themselves in harm's way to stop it, they're trained to do that. Idea being this person is too important to lose. The world keeps going if you die, but if he dies, we got problems. That's people's judgments and people's thinking about situation. The role doesn't make them better. What is true about humanity? Everybody sitting in this room, anybody watching online, anybody that watches the video in the next 25 years, let's even go down. Let's just say that the video stays around for 1,000 years. And time goes on, and generation after generation after generation after generation is born, and those people watch this video. The same is going to be true for them as is true for us. We are all connected. Eve is named Eve because she is the mother of all the living. The entire earth was populated by the 3 sons of Noah. They all were born of the same parents, right? So all of our family trees are connected. All of humanity is connected. All of us actually came from the same source. There is not any one of us that is anything any more than anyone else. We have different skills, we have different abilities, we have a lot of things. But ultimately, we're all human. And the Bible presents it that way.
Humanity for centuries always wanted to a certain status.
Sure. And it makes us feel good to think that we're, well, I'm not even going to get into it. I'm just going to say, listen, at any point in time, almost any person walks into a room and they think they're the smartest person in the room. That's just the fact of the matter. We don't like to talk about it, but that's the fact of the matter. And it's not true. And a lot of people might be surprised to find out that there are some studies that have been done that suggest that there's an inordinately high number of geniuses that hold a particular occupation. Anybody want to guess what that is? Trash collector. It's the weirdest thing. You know what the theory is? Because they're actually smarter than most of the people around them, they don't get along very well with most people around them, and it's a job that allows them to be solitary all day and never talk to people. And so it gives them some actual rest. I don't know if it's right or not. I don't know if that's really the reason but they did some studies and found that there was an inordinate number of trash collectors who had exceptionally high IQs. Now, it was just one study, and it could have been off, but My point is this: you never know when you're going to run into someone who is actually smarter than you. You don't know what they're going to be doing. But most of us don't go, oh, he's a garbage collector, he must be a genius. But they do things like that with people like doctors and lawyers, which means that we actually equate education and years of education to things like that more than we do ability. All of that to make this point, all of that ranking that we do is completely arbitrary and subjective. From an absolute standpoint, we're all from the exact same creative process. Adam and Eve were created by God, and every human being that's breathing is connected to that creation. The only one that had, well, he didn't even have less, so I can't even say that. Yes, ma'am.
Like men have don't have the abilities women do with the household, but also women have more of their emotions on their sleeve rather than men, most men. But I've met, and we've all met a lot of emotional
Yep.
men. But I'm just saying that.
I understand what you're saying. Right. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I'm not going to say that you're wrong. In fact, generally there are some truths about some things. However, as someone who has been beat up by a female, as an adult, of course, to be fair, she was an Olympic level judoka, and I'm not even close to an Olympic level judoka, and we were on the judo mat, and she's just a whole lot better trained and skilled than I am. But I'll even add to that, not only was she's blind. I'm gonna tell you, I'm not real big on arguing physiological differences between the sexes. I think it's a moot and pointless argument. And what has happened is, for instance, I'm going to tell you, I do believe that for a lot of time and in a lot of places and circumstances, there were assumptions made that this must mean that we're better. This must mean that we're smarter. This must mean that we're more capable because God's given us this responsibility and not them this. And there was an uneven playing field and a poor attitude. The response to those kinds of situations are almost always the same, and that is we react to the opposite extreme rather than seeking truth. Okay? And so what happens is I've got to prove that I'm smarter than them, and that women are actually superior to them, and that they're and so there's this big struggle we called it in the 70s the battle of the sexes, to the point of stupid stuff. Anybody remember the tennis match in the Astrodome? Astrodome full of people, televised, whole 9 yards. All of that is ridiculous, because what we need to settle in is what is true about us, and then what we're responsible for. And these two verses are important, and the reason this comes up in the conversation, and I'm taking so much time with this, is because where were the men? And let's just go specifically. The 12 who were closely associated with him. What did he say they were going to do when he was struck down? They're going to scatter like sheep without a shepherd. And after that, he dies, and we're told there were also women looking on. Now, they were from a distance. I don't blame them. But there were women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, so now we're expanding this. We're going all the way back to when he was in Galilee. Way back to the early part of his ministry. When he was in Galilee, they followed him. They ministered to him. There were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. There was 120 disciples that kind of stayed together after the crucifixion. Those are the 120 that are mentioned in the book of Acts, the early part of the book of Acts. I don't know what the breakdown of those 120 were, but this makes it clear that a good number of them were women. We know that it was women who supported him, who gave money to them so that they had food and the things that they needed in their ministry. There was many other women who traveled from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem with him. It never presents anything other than the fact that women were there and involved and engaged at all times. Because the apostles were all men, because all the teaching was men, the public teaching was men, maybe I should say it that way, because not all the teaching was men. In fact, we are introduced in one case to a man named Apollos who was lacking in some knowledge, and he was taught by whom? Priscilla and Aquila, who are a husband and wife. So, despite the fact that all the public teaching was done by men, despite the fact that the apostles were men, that the elders are said to be men, that preachers who stand up publicly and proclaim are intended to be, besides that, that doesn't mean that women weren't there, that women weren't involved, that women weren't engaged, that they weren't doing their part. And it doesn't mean that one is more important than the other. That's part of the argument in 1 Corinthians 14. What about people who had miraculous gifts compared to those who didn't have miraculous gifts? Were some of them more important? Were the people who could do miracles more important than the people who couldn't? And he said, no. In fact, where would the body be unless all the parts were present? There was a purpose, there was a role, there was something they needed to do. God empowered them to do what they needed to do, but that's as far as it went. It doesn't mean that they're more important, that they're more valuable, that they're more, it doesn't mean anything like that. And so we need to get away from rank ordering people the way that we do, or being enamored by things like people's education, or any of those things. And instead, view everyone as a human being created in the image of God who has a purpose and a role to play within his kingdom. And stop all the nonsense. Because what's even worse than the people who are trying to swing the pendulum so far in the other direction are the people who are resisting it, making all the foolish arguments of male supremacy. None of us are supreme. We're all brethren. We have a common nature. We have an equal value before God. That is why Jesus taught that in his kingdom there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free. Doesn't matter. He didn't say that you didn't continue to be a slave when you became a Christian. He said it doesn't matter that you're a slave. You're just as valuable as the one who's free. There's neither male nor female. Doesn't matter that the roles are different. One is not more valuable than another. I could actually make an argument that the role that's given to women, despite the fact that it's not public teaching in the kingdom of God, is probably more important. There's an idiom in our language connected to it. Anybody know what I'm talking about? The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. That responsibility of bearing children. Paul even points out its importance by saying that women are saved through carrying out that responsibility. Now, that's not to say that women don't have to do other things. He's just simply saying, don't discount it. Don't think that that's unimportant. Because I want to tell you something, we have ceded the role of raising our children to other people, and society's paying a price for it. We shouldn't discount how important that role is, how important that responsibility is. Women were there. Women were actually there. Apparently, there was one man in this group. I don't know how many men total in the group, but anybody know who was present with these women? Mark doesn't talk about it at all. You'll have to get it from one of the other Gospels. From the cross, I don't think Mark talked about it. I'm pretty sure he didn't. John, because Jesus actually gave John some instructions from the cross. He told John to do what? Take care of his mother. He told his mother, woman, behold your son, behold your mother. In other words, he was asking John to fill the role of a son to his mother. We know John was there. Other than that, I don't know that any male is named as being there. That apparently the disciples who were male were the chickens, and the ones that were bold enough to associate themselves with him even in death, even though they kept some distance from him, were the women. Or at least largely that's true. So anyway, that's kind of just a subtext lesson that is worth talking about for a little while because of the times and the attitudes where we currently find ourselves. One of the biggest problems among humanity is the struggle for control. And the ability to relinquish control is a virtue that doesn't get talked about enough. Being able to say, you know what, it doesn't matter whether or not I'm in control. What matters is that I follow God. And I'll do that wherever I am and whatever circumstances I find myself in. That's what Paul was talking about in Philippians. We look at people like Daniel, who was taken into a foreign country and made a slave. That was fine, but what did he continue to do? He continued to honor God. He couldn't go to Jerusalem to the temple and worship God, but he could turn and face Jerusalem and pray to God. And so that's what he did 3 times a day. Even after the king said, can't do that, he did it anyway. And he said, you do what you need to do, but this is what I have to do. He didn't defy the authority of his captors. He didn't defy the authority of the king. He was willing to accept that authority, but he understood that authority ultimately rested with God. And so if submitting to God meant that he had to relinquish even his life, then so be it. Same thing with his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which we never can remember their Hebrew names. We always remember their Babylonian names for some reason. Mishael was one of them. I don't remember which one. But anyway, the same thing with the apostles later in their lives. The same, they were willing to forfeit their life in order to, that famous statement in Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. If you look at that whole context, he says, you decide what's right and wrong. You decide what you need to do about it, but we must obey God rather than men. That actually was a submissive statement by him saying, look, I know you have the power to jail us and beat us or kill us if you want to, but we have to keep honoring God, and if that's what you need to do, then fine. letting go of that drive to control will relieve us of a whole lot of sin in our lives. So we need to be careful not to swing to either extreme on these things. Accept the truth, preach the truth, deal with the consequences of accepting and preaching the truth, and know that God is faithful. All right, any questions or comments about that before we get back into the focus of this study? We are not going to get finished with Mark this week. When evening had come, verse 42, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God. Now, this is an interesting description of this man. He was a Jewish man. He was a member of the council. He was engaged. I don't know. It doesn't actually say here that he was a Pharisee, but most of the members of the council were. He was respected. So he was a respectable Jew, which means what? He kept the law, and the other people around him recognized him as being a good Jew. They did not recognize Jesus as being a good Jew, but they did recognize this man as being a good Jew. So he was not a troublemaker of any kind. He wasn't looking to upset the system. He was part of the system. But what else was he doing? He was looking for the kingdom. That's an important phrase. Yes, ma'am.
Joseph was Jesus' earthly father, who was no longer with the family and lived in Arimathea.
Nope, not as far as I know. Not any reason to conclude that at all. But that's an interesting thing. Now, names are really weird, names are really weird, period. Right. But just so you know, I made the argument one time to someone that just because someone's name is Michael Green doesn't mean that their parents are the same parents as mine. Anyway, he was looking for the kingdom. It says he took courage. Why does it say he took courage? That's right, because what he's fixing to do is something that could upset that respectableness and that position, because the people on the council are the ones who did what? Demanded that he die. So at the time that they were demanding that he die, apparently Joseph wasn't bold enough to stand up and say, no, we shouldn't do this. But on this point, it says he took courage. That tells us, by the way, that courage is something that we can take up and lay down. Courage is not something that's inborn, that we just are or are not. Courage is something that we can take up or lay down. He took courage and he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. Summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, and we know how they determined that. From other places, they went out there, they stuck a spear in his side. He granted the corpse to Joseph, and Joseph bought a linen shroud, taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a moment and make this observation that I don't know that I've heard too many people make before. I'm sure somebody has. I'm not claiming that I've come up with something ingenious and new. But that is this: where are his disciples? Why is this a council member? Now, to be fair, it's probably because he was a respected council member that he got away with it without it being a problem. And it may have been a problem down the road. We don't know that. But anyway, it may be because of who he was that Pilate was even willing to release it. But the point I'm making is that the people that you would think would want to do something like this are not the ones doing it. It's someone that you would have looked at, any one of us would have looked at from the outside and thought, he's one of the enemy. He's with the council demanded his death, he's a respected Jew, he's got influence with them. He's not one of us, he's one of them. And yet one of them is the one who's taking care of the body of Jesus, when no one else is doing anything about it. That does tell us about his character a little bit and just how serious he was about seeking the kingdom. But it also speaks to us in terms of not making decisions for other people. And I hear this stuff all the time. Oh, they're not interested in the gospel. No point in going to talk to them. Shamefully, I've thought that before. How do I know? Until I go ask. So anyway, he lays him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock, and we find out in other places that that tomb actually had been hewn out recently. And for what purpose? For him. That was his future resting place that he gave to be used for the Lord. By the way, there's also some prophecy being fulfilled, because there was prophecy that he would be numbered with the transgressors and with the rich. This was a wealthy man. He was getting buried in a wealthy part of the cemetery. Anyway, he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. That becomes important because they're the ones that go Sunday morning on the first day of the week to go check on the tomb. How do they know? Well, they saw. They watched it. That also tells us that they didn't just sit there and then go home. When the crucifixion was done, when he was dead, when Joseph got permission to take the body and he went and took it, and to be fair, it probably wasn't Joseph himself that did it. He probably had servants, and he probably had his servants actually carry the body. But anyway, when he took the body, took control of the body, and moved it to his tomb, they also followed and saw where it was done and what happened. So they're at a distance, and they are separating themselves somewhat, but they're interested enough. That also explains why on that morning it was the women who came. Because guess who knew where he was? The women. So anyway, that's what's going on as Sabbath is approaching. Then the Sabbath. What happens on the Sabbath? Yeah, we have no information in this book about what happened on that Sabbath. It says, as the Sabbath is approaching, this is what happened. Stone was rolled in front of the tomb when the Sabbath was passed. We don't know. That's right. And 90% of the people in the room don't know what we're talking about, but I do know what you're talking about. There is a debate as to whether or not it was a Friday, whether or not this was a high Sabbath that was a practice of the Jews that didn't necessarily always fall on Saturday. But what I can tell you, the reason I personally am persuaded that it was the Sabbath is because it says very early on the first day of the week in verse 2, which means it is the Saturday Sabbath that had to have passed. The only question would come in is if there was a high Sabbath on Friday and then they observed the traditional Saturday Sabbath, and I don't know anything about those practices, so I would not start to presume. But to let everyone know and to bring everybody up to speed, we won't get into it too deep unless y'all want to. I'll have the discussion if you want to. But the question is, how was he in the tomb for 3 days? if it was Friday evening when he was buried and Sunday morning when he was raised. Because the sign of Jonah, 3 days and nights in the belly of the earth, how was he 3 days and nights if he was only there Friday night, Saturday night, and then rose on Sunday morning? To get it to 3 days and 3 nights, you have to expand that time frame. There's lots of mental gymnastics that you can do to argue both directions, but anyway, if somebody wants to have that conversation, let me know. I'll be happy to. I don't know that we can conclude absolutely one way or the other. I think that I read what's there and I have my opinion, and other people read what's there and they have opinions that agree with me, and other people read what's there and they have opinions that disagree with me. What I know is what's there. I do know that the events of chapter 16 happened on Sunday morning, what we call Sunday morning. They didn't call it Sunday, but the first day of the week, because it expressly says that. And I'm out of time, so this is as good a place as any to stop. So we will probably, in all likelihood, I'll say almost definitely get through this next week. And so again, I'll put my plea out there. If you have some thoughts as to what you want to study after we finish Mark, let me know. Thanks for your presence and your comments.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory.